Sometimes the most interesting story isn't the one making all the headlines. In the City of Eunice, everyone was talking about an investigation into police misconduct. But it turns out the real story might just be buried in the paperwork and how the city paid for that investigation. We're going to look at a strange case where the process of enforcing the rules might have broken some pretty important rules itself.
Yeah, so while the focus was on the police, we're going to do something different. We're going to follow the money. Because the financial paper trail for this whole investigation, well, it tells a completely different story. It's a story about public finance, accountability, and what happens when a city seems to bypass its own safeguards. Let's just stick to the documents and see what they tell us.
All right, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the price tag for the investigation. Then, we'll follow the money using public records. We'll dive into the city's own rulebook on spending, see where what happened doesn't match the policy, and finally, we'll talk about why any of this really matters.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The City of Eunice brought in an outside firm, Beacon Investigations, to run an internal affairs investigation on some police officers. Now, that's pretty standard practice, but of course, it costs money, and that's right where our story really gets going. So now, let's follow that money. We're going to set aside why they did the investigation for a second and just focus on a really basic question. How much did it cost? And maybe more importantly, was that cost properly approved? Well, thankfully, the city's own financial records give us the answers. Here we go. This is the starting point. It's purchase order number 1-3-117. And you can see it right there. It authorizes payment for the investigation and sets a very clear spending limit. $18,000. Flat. That's not a suggestion. That's the approved budget. But that's not what the city ended up paying. Not even close. When you look at the final invoice summary, the total payment comes out to $20,355.26. That's a lot more than the authorized amount. Do the math, and it's a difference of $2,355.26. So the final bill went over the approved purchase order by that much. And this brings up the big question, right? Was this extra spending properly approved before the money went out the door?
Well, we don't have to guess. We have the answer, and it comes straight from the city manager, Shannon Cummins. In a memo, she states, and I'm quoting her here, "I was not made aware of this or I would have asked for an increase to the PO." I mean, that's about as direct as it gets. No, it was not pre-approved. And this slide just lays it out there plain as day. On the left, you've got the official purchase order for $18,000. On the right, the final payment for over $20,000. The documents themselves show you the gap. There's no ambiguity here.
So what should have happened? To figure that out, we just need to look at the City of Eunice's own rulebook, their official purchasing policy. Let's see what the city's own procedures demand when they spend public money.
According to the city's own policy manual, the entire reason they have a purchase order system is, and this is a direct quote from their rules, to make sure that authorization of public funds has occurred before the purchase. That word, before, is everything.
And the policy has some really specific numbers in it. That final bill, the one over $20,000, well, it didn't just go over budget. It crossed a critical line, a specific threshold that triggers a whole other set of rules. You see, once a purchase goes over $20,000, the city's own policy says two things have to happen. Number one, the purchase order has to be created in the finance department. And number two, there it is again, authorization is required before the funds are spent. So now we have the rules, and we have the reality based on the documents. Let's put them side by side, because this is where the whole procedural breakdown becomes, well, impossible to ignore.
This table really sums it up perfectly. The policy requires prior authorization. The reality, the city manager says, "I was not made aware of this." The policy requires the finance department to be involved for anything over 20 grand. There's no paperwork showing that happened. And another part of the policy says they need 3 written quotes for a spend this big. Again, no documentation.
The real issue here is the complete lack of a paper trail. There's no amended PO, no separate approval for the overage, no sign the finance department was ever involved. And maybe the most telling detail of all? The city produced a form called a sole source justification, a document that could have explained why the normal rules were bypassed. It's completely blank. So, why does any of this matter? I mean, it's a bunch of procedural stuff, right? Well, these rules aren't just bureaucracy for the sake of it. They exist for one very simple reason: to protect taxpayer money. And let me be perfectly clear. This explainer isn't about whether the Beacon investigation was good or bad or necessary or not. The only question on the table here, based on the city's own documents, is whether the financial controls that are supposed to protect public money were actually followed. It all boils down to a core principle of public finance. The entire system is built on getting authorization before you spend the money, not just acknowledging an overcharge after the bill comes in. That principle is what ensures accountability. And in a final twist that is just dripping with irony, a source pointed out that the city manager's own email signature includes this quote: "Integrity is what you do when no one is watching." It's an incredible quote that just perfectly captures what this is all about. Financial controls are about institutional integrity. It's about following the rules, especially when it's inconvenient.
And that just leaves us with this one last question to think about. In the process of holding some people accountable, the city seems to have bypassed its own rules for financial accountability. So, if you bend the rules that protect public money in order to enforce other rules, what does that say about integrity in the end?